welcome you all today. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder of the Parent Education Series, now in its 15th year, and proud co-founder of the new nonprofit, the Parent Venture. I'm here today with Dr. Donald Grant. In the background is my partner. Oops, Donald, where'd you go? Well, he's going to come back on. My partner, Bev Hartman, is in the background handling the chat. She is the other co-founder of the Parent Venture. So we know that this is an important and timely topic. I don't think it could be any more timely than today, the day after a national election. So we welcome you, Donald. Thank you for coming, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say. Before we get started, a few quick thank yous and logistical things that I want to share with you. First of all, special thank you to Dr. Grant, to the Carlmont PTSA, to Sequoia Healthcare District, Sequoia Union High School District, and the Parent Venture, without whose support this series would not be possible. We are more than a speaker series. We are a parent education series. And this program from the beginning has been based on the developmental tenets of children and adolescents. Dr. Grant is an expert in this area, which makes him all the more perfect for today's discussion. So we are excited. Again, Dr. Grant is going to offer about 30 minutes of discussion, and then we're going to open it up to you, the audience, for Q&A. We ask today, because we want to get to as many of your questions as possible, we ask that you keep your questions kind of brief and put them in the Q&A tab. Most of you are probably familiar with the Zoom screen by now if you have children, but again, on the bottom, there is both a chat button where you'll be seeing links from Bev, my partner, about Dr. Grant's work, the Parent Education Series, and the Parent Venture. But there's also a Q&A button for webinars. So we would like you to put your questions in that Q&A button. Keep them short and kind of general if you can. We're going to try to get to as many of them as possible. And then finally, you'll see a survey link in the chat towards the end of this event. We hope you'll take 2 minutes to give us a little bit of feedback. I promise we read them all, and it is an important way for us both to evaluate and to improve this program. So thank you, everybody. Let me tell you a little bit about today's keynote speaker. Dr. Donald Grant began his career as a middle school science teacher in Baltimore, Maryland, after graduating from Hampton University with a degree in biology. He holds a doctorate in clinical psychology and serves in 2 executive director roles, one with his training and consulting firm, Mindful Training Solutions, and the other at the Center for Community and Social Impact at Pacific Oaks College. Dr. Grant is a national thought leader in issues of race and racism, a social cultural analyst, mental health and mindfulness expert, educator, and social services advocate. He is also an international speaker and workshop facilitator, film and TV consultant. I've seen you on Good Morning America, Donald, and a published author. His latest book, Black Men, Intergenerational Colonialism and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations, was published in 2019. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Dr. Donald Grant. Take it away, Donald.
Thank you for that, Charlene. Such a pleasure to be with you all. And again, so honored by the work that you all are doing. You really helping to situate things and make sure that people get the knowledge and information they need. So I'm really happy to be with you all today. It'd be great to be up north with you all in person. I'm down here in Los Angeles, but we're going to go ahead and get started and get going with the presentation. And so, you know, please, as Charlene said, don't hesitate to post any questions in the chat box as you guys move forward. You know, keeping that in mind, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. All right, here we go. And you can see my screen, right, Charlene?
Yes, I can, Donald. Looks perfect.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So today we're going to dive into this construct of courageous conversations and what that means, but how to do it as it relates to race and racism. You know, as Charlene said, I have a bachelor's degree in biology, a doctoral degree in clinical psychology, and I'm a certified equity, diversity, and inclusion trainer. I worked for LA County Department of Mental Health for many years, and have worked in different community settings. Mindfulness is something that we're going to pay attention to, and I'll check in with you all throughout the presentation. We're going to do about 30 minutes of content and then have about 30 minutes for questions and answers at the end and for discussion. But what I really want you all to be able to do today is pay attention to how you're experiencing the content and the discussion and what that means. When we practice mindfulness, we're able to pay attention to our experiences and not judge them. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important as we move through the conversation as it relates to our ability to really create change. So we're really going to just dive in. And here is what we're going to ground our work in, and that's the cycle of systemic oppression and what that looks like, the different components that contribute to this particular cycle. Today, we're talking specifically about racism, but what I like to do is I like to integrate different types of oppression in so that people can really gain a true understanding of what that looks like. And so, what we'll do is we'll start with this cycle of systemic oppression, but we'll look at it through the lens of sexism to ground us today. And then we'll move into the specificities of race, understanding that the isms are all kind of connected in a very similar way, understanding that the power dynamic is one of the important components that we pay attention to. And so if we were to start anywhere on this cycle, we'd be able to move through it. But here we'll start at systemic mistreatment of the group. When we look at sexism and misogyny, we understand that women across several domains are treated and engaged very differently than men. And so let's use the workplace for an example for women. And so we look and we talk about the numbers of executives in the C-suites across Fortune 500 companies. And we know that the number of women in that group is very limited. When we look at why people say they don't hire and why people say these individuals are not accessing these careers, we tend to create justification for this. We tend to say, well, women are raising children and working at the same time. And so we don't want to burden them with the responsibilities, or women are not strong enough or not mindful enough to really engage in these practices. And so we create reasons by which we don't engage them. And as a result, men see themselves as the primary CEOs and chiefs across the country, well, really across the world, and we continue to move in that direction. And when hiring managers are interviewing women, they're looking at it from a normative way that men would operate. And then internalized dominance is created as a result because women begin to feel like, well, maybe I'm not really fit for the C-suite. Maybe, or internalized dominance, I'm sorry, men create this dominance to say, of course, they don't belong here. And then women begin to believe that as the internalized part of oppression. Society accepts it and normalizes it. And then we create this false information about it. And we really want to pay attention to how these systems work. And what we're going to do now is walk through kind of a narrative that describes how this works with racism and what we need to pay attention to. And so after we move forward, we understand that when we intersect race and gender, this is an example of structural racism and how it works. Most of us are familiar with the Felicity Huffman case and the array of adults, primarily celebrities, primarily white celebrities of wealth and affluence, pay different institutions to gain access for their children. Well, Tanya McDowell lied on her application for her son's kindergarten and was sentenced to 5 years in jail. Whereas Felicity Huffman and the other people who were part of that cohort paid big money and bribes and all sorts of things. And Felicity Huffman got 14 days in jail. When we talk about intersectionality, what we see here is gender, race, and class. And it's important to note that the structures of our country perpetuate these things. So let's ground ourselves in some common language. It's really important that we understand and speak from the same information so that we can be on the same page. A stereotype is an internal thought, and that internal thought is reflective of different experiences that we've had. Maybe it's been history, maybe it's been an array of things that have created a stereotype, and we'll dig in more to how those things are formed. Those stereotypes lead to these internal feelings that we call prejudices. We can have prejudices about a variety of things, and I'm going to give us a very nebulous example in the next slide. When our prejudices, those internal feelings that are created from stereotypes, when they begin to live outside of our bodies, they become discrimination because we begin to behave on the things that we have prejudices for or against. When you drop discrimination into a bucket of a system, you now begin to see racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism. And we'll talk about the nuanced differences between discrimination and racism. Unconscious bias is a really important component of this, but people overestimate how knowledge on unconscious bias has the capacity to break structural racism. Being aware is one thing, but understanding how these unconscious biases work and how to dismantle them is really the critical part. And so when people say, "Oh, can you come and do a training on unconscious bias?" I say I can, but we have to move beyond unconscious bias into cultural empathy. And just understanding unconscious bias is not significant enough to do that. And so here's an example of how heuristics and stereotypes work. You're looking at a screen full of different door exit devices. Many of you have seen an array of these and many others. When you approach one of these door exit devices, all who operate differently, most of us aren't confused on how to get out of that room. You wouldn't necessarily sit there and say, "Wee, sheesh, I'd really love to exit this room, but I can't figure out how." It's because you've created a schema or a heuristic for door exit devices such that you just manipulated an exit, even if none of them look like the doorknobs that you have at home. The problem is that we not only do this with doorknobs, we use these heuristics with people. These heuristics then lead to those stereotypes and prejudices, which lead to behaviors like discrimination. We've held these and had these for so long that it's really challenging to associate and to really build confidence in not relying upon those heuristics. The reason that is because it creates cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is this kind of tension that builds up when humans have two competing thoughts that are really challenging to reconcile. And so here's an example. When we talk about enslavement in America, we understand that our country labeled it as chattel slavery. What that means is it references a category of property that dehumanizes the individuals who were being held as property. Now, they may not have known it or recognized it at that time, but that restructuring was related to cognitive dissonance. It was challenging for a slave owner to brutally beat an enslaved person and still consider them a human being equal to them. In order to maintain the oppressive and physically brutal and death enforcing tactics that were used on slave plantations, individuals perpetuating them had to curate a new story because cognitive dissonance requires two things, one of two things to happen for the tension to break. You either change the truth or you change your behaviors. Some of us find new information and we change our behaviors. Well, sheesh, in the 80s, we didn't know that smoking had such a high degree of connection to cancer. People got that information and they said, "Oh, we have to stop letting people smoke on airplanes." They begin to change their behavior in order to accommodate that new information. When we talk about race and racism, our country has maintained a very deliberate and strategic business continuity model that we'll attend to today that has allowed it to be very difficult for us to break the cognitive dissonance by changing our behavior. more often than not, we are changing the truth in the same ways that had to happen during the times of enslavement in order for that institution to perpetuate throughout America. It would be difficult to maintain your ideology of self as a kind, loving human being who was ascribed to whatever religious tradition you were and behave in the ways that you had to behave in order to maintain the system of enslavement. And so when we talk about anti-Black and anti-Brown racism as a business model, that strikes people really hard. And so again, I want to remind you of mindfulness practices and to be honest with yourself about how you're feeling through this portion of the discussion. There is a man presenting to you saying that there is a deliberate effort to maintain systems of oppression against specific groups of people, and that means something. And so let's talk about what are the factors that contribute to making that happen. Historical revisionism and negationism are two major tools that have been used throughout American history in order to maintain the narrative that we've created. What that does is it maintains these structures and structural racism, classism, sexism, and it continues to perpetuate them. If you think about the bail bond system in America, and we're in the middle of an election um, cycle, moment, movement, whatever it may be called. I hope you guys are all practicing some self care in the middle of all this that we have going on. But when you think about how revisionism and negationism has been used, we have, for instance, our bail bond system, which demonstrates that people with wealth are able to access services and live at home while trials are pending in the ways that other people don't. And so that's an example of how we've utilized classism as a business continuity model to maintain certain groups of people as an underclass. Here you see a story of Christopher Columbus, and you see it juxtaposed to what I call a colonized story and a decolonized story. The decolonized story is what has been X'd out, and the colonized story is the one that we promote more often. The colonized stories that we promote in America are all aimed at the maintenance of this particular facet of our world, of our worldview. Even our systems of American education are grounded in a revisionist history, understanding that we ascribe a lot of what we do to these particular philosophers. Many of us are not able to accommodate information that demonstrates that those men all studied in Kemetic libraries, and the archaeological record demonstrates that to be true. We understand that liberal arts education was also grounded in Northern Africa, and many of the pieces of knowledge that have grown from that are never attributed to that tradition. When we talk about the attributions of education and who it is for and who it isn't for, we understand that if there was a grounded history where this particular level of education was honored for its origins, what might that do to people of color and the access that they feel towards education? I grew up in a housing project in Buffalo, New York, and I was bused to this wonderful school outside of my neighborhood, an honors magnet school from fifth grade to 12th grade. And when I would return to my community, I would be told, "You talk white." Now, I'd respond with, "It's actually you speak white." No, I never did that. But looking at how a quote unquote proper command of the king's English is reserved for one particular group speaks to how this business model has been created and maintained throughout time. Religion has also been used as a tool. As you travel up the coast, you see all of these particular missions that were created for the disenfranchisement and murder of indigenous Mexican people and different and other indigenous groups on this land. The Bible has been restructured in many ways to maintain systems of oppression. This wonderful story in the Bible actually juxtaposes itself to the archaeological record to demonstrate that it was an Ethiopian king who actually saved King Hezekiah from the Assyrians. And when we look, This is actually a story that describes how an African king actually rescued the development of the three major world religions. Judaism was a fledgling religion at this time, and had the walls of Jerusalem been breached by the Assyrians, King Hezekiah would have never been able to propagate Judaism. And we know that Judaism laid the groundwork for Islam and for Christianity. What if the world knew that this was the case? These are three great books that will allow you to explore further these components of change and negationism that have happened throughout time. The Rescue of Jerusalem talks about that story I was just referencing about King Taharka and his army traveling from Ethiopia to save the walls of Jerusalem. Stolen Legacy speaks about the Greek philosophers coming to Africa to study, and they came before Columbus, gives a particular framework of existence of people of African descent on this land prior to our enslavement. I know we have not a lot of time, and I want to make sure that we touch on these important components. And so please excuse me if I move through a little bit quickly, understanding that we'll have time on the back end to make sure we can discuss further. And I'll be able to pull up some of the slides if there are questions that reference some of them. This is an example of forced assimilation to talk about the ways in which America has approached our coexistence. Assimilation, segregation, melting pot, and multiculturalism are different ways, and multiculturalism is our current goal. Many of us still exist in the melting pot phase where everything kind of looks the same. And that's an example of what this is. These are Native American, Indigenous, First Nations people, side by side pictures of what colonialism forced them to do in their efforts to be a melting pot and have everybody ascribe to a very Eurocentric framework of who they should be. This wasn't just physical. These individuals were beaten for speaking in their native language and forced to not engage with their cultural traditions. Now we're moving more towards multiculturalism, which I like to describe as a salad. In a salad, you have your lettuce, tomatoes, onions, croutons, whatever it is you like. And each of those individual ingredients get to maintain the integrity of what they are, but still contribute to one full whole. An important question that we don't always ask, and this is the topic and the content of my current research for my new book, is how did European immigrants become white? What I'm looking at is now the intergenerational role of the oppressor. We oftentimes talk about the intergenerational role of the oppressed, and we're going to talk briefly about what that looks like. But what we don't oftentimes talk about is the fact that when these European immigrants arrived on this land, they weren't considered white people. They were ascribed and named according to their national origin. So people who arrived from Greece were Greek. They were Greek immigrants. People who arrived from Germany, they were German immigrants. And so when we move into our discussion phase, we're going to talk a little bit about how white people became white and what that grounded identity means as it relates to dismantling structural racism and how that works and what that should look like. These are really two great books and one article that speaks about this particular topic. The History of White People, How Italians Became White is an article published in the New York Times from last year, and Working Toward Whiteness. These are opportunities for you all to dig a little bit deeper and understand the cultural context by which white identity in America was actually developed. So let's talk a little bit about business continuity model planning in these last 5 or 6 minutes, so that you can understand very clearly what I mean about the development of structural racism, particularly as it relates to the disenfranchisement of Black and Brown people in our nation. So many of you may remember this place. You may have walked through aisles and aisles picking up videos, and you spend $50 and you don't watch them all. You bring them back. You forgot to rewind the ones that you wanted to watch, that you did watch. You pay the extra fee. Well, at one point in time, somebody came to Blockbuster and they said, guess what? Soon you're going to be able to watch any movie that you want right from your living room couch. Blockbuster said, no, that's never going to happen. As a result, nobody goes to Blockbuster. And I think there's one Blockbuster in the nation that still exists. Blockbuster did not have a business continuity model. They didn't identify and analyze risks. They didn't create strategic plans to mitigate them so that they could then measure the outcomes year over year. Blockbuster didn't have one, but America did. So when you hear me say the business continuity model of oppression, we're speaking about the development of structural racism and all the components that had to go in. Slavery created one of the first global economies in our world, whereby by 1860, America was shipping out more than 80% of the world's cotton. Unlike Blockbuster, when the threat of emancipation was first on the books, these men came together to discover how they would be able to maintain the business model that they had created. That timeline serves us to show enslavement leading to convict leasing and debt peonage, and contemporarily, our prison industrial complex has created this through line that has allowed the maintenance of the disenfranchisement and oppression of Black and Brown men across our nation for very deliberate purposes. When we look at one of the major tools that was used both on the East and West to maintain this oppression, excuse me, we know that lynching was a major source of activity that led to this. We understand that just last year, we're looking at passing an anti-lynching law as an effort to undo some of the pain that still exists. When we look at what lynching is and how it was used as a tool of oppression. And when we think about what we call intergenerational trauma, my grandfather raised my father according to the fears that he grew up with in Mississippi, understanding that if he was out past night, this was a possibility for his world. When we think about my current research that I described, it's also important to note there was a time when these things were happening where white families and white communities would go to their neighbors and say, hey guys, we're going to go chase down a Black guy hanging from a tree and set him on fire. Grab your kids, bring a sandwich and some drinks. If you see here in this left picture, this young girl here is currently the age of a college student's grandparent. When we talk about structural racism and we talk about the need to dismantle this, we don't oftentimes talk about the traumas that these individuals experienced, the schemas and heuristics created by these experiences, and what we need to do to dismantle them. As a business continuity model, here are two maps. We see on the left the total lynchings in America from 1882 to 1968. And you can almost superimpose that map onto the executions by state in America from 1977 to 2013. We live in two different worlds, and it's important to note that there are certain people who are in danger as a result of our policies and practices that others are not. When we talk about this work and what we need to do to address it and fix it, it's important that you note what you see. Taking a look at this picture, some of you are seeing two different images. Those of you who took a very early psychology course, you may already see both images and know who they are, know what they are. Well, one image here is a young woman and one is an older woman. When you think about what it is you actually see in the world, our experiences play such a significant role. Many of you see the older woman here that I've just circled. Others of you see the younger woman here that I just circled. Some of you still don't see it at all, but that's okay too. Our experiences play a role in what we see. And so what I wanted to do was just give us a couple of tangible examples of how structural and institutional racism have played out and why it's important for us to understand and know today. And so we're going to use this quick example. And Charlene and Bev, I know we're at the 12:30 mark. I'm going to do this and then we'll come together for discussion. When we look at the Servicemen Readjustment Act of 1944, oftentimes commonly known as the GI Bill, we know that America provided $95 billion in social supports for about 16 million returning soldiers from war. That included job training, college tuition, home loans, small business supports, and all sorts of other things. We know that that created the modern day middle class and fueled the suburbs. What we also know is that there were a whole sector of men who were not able to access these particular services through the GI Bill. So let's look at two families that we juxtapose, one who was able to access these resources and one who was not. Here's Philip. Philip was born in 1947. His dad was white. He's white. Philadelphia, high school diploma. He was able to gain access to the low interest mortgage provisions of the GI Bill. As a result, he was able to move his family from public housing to a segregated suburb, purchased his home. Family was able to borrow against that home, sending Philip to college, who then graduates debt-free, gets a professional job, buys a home, and then inherits his father's appreciated home after his father's death. Ray and Philip have a similar background, except Ray and his father are Black. Same city, same time frame. When Ray returned from war, he was unable to access the home loan due to restrictive underwriting, and he remained in segregated communities in rental property. They couldn't afford to send Ray to school, and as a result, he got a diploma from an under-resourced segregated school, worked minimum wage jobs, and continued to live in family home. He had to actually borrow money to bury his father after he died. So now let's fast forward to Philip's children. He gives his children their father's appreciated home. They live in thriving communities. College is paid for with home equity, and Philip establishes a trust fund for his grandchildren. This is what we refer to as three generations of accumulated advantage. If we juxtapose that to raise children, no house to inherit, raises children in disinvested communities, completes college with work study loans, and has no personal assets to leave his grandchildren. This is an example of three generations of intergenerational disadvantage. And these are three books that provide additional context related to intergenerational advantage and disadvantage. I have not read The Matthew Effect, but I've heard good things about it. When affirmative action was white and the hidden cost of being African American. I've thumbed through both of them, but not in their completion. Oppression is grounded in trauma, and it's important to note that we first understood intergenerational trauma as a result of the Jewish Holocaust survivors and their children. In 1966, therapists began to see a slew of Holocaust survivors' children come into therapy, and that's when they first began to track that trauma, racial trauma, can be sent through generations. And historical trauma is a great area of research right now. It's important to understand that today's contemporary traumas lead to tomorrow's historical trauma. And what's happening at the border right now with our Latinx families is important to note that you're going to see a trend in a generation from now where their children are going to be experiencing the intergenerational trauma of this in the same way that we see our First Nations people experiencing that with these particular outcomes. This is not a coincidence that we see our Native American populations disproportionately represented in these areas if we pay attention to the history of colonialism and things that they've experienced. Epigenetics talks about the science of how this is passed through our DNA. Our DNA is not mutated, but it functions in a way where proteins are produced in a different way as a result of this history with race-based trauma en masse. Race-based stress is really important to pay attention to. We see these disparate outcomes with our Black and Latinx populations, and that adds to race-based stress, and it's actually a function of structural racism, the fact that these disparities continue to exist. Last thing I want to note is, how do we pay attention to white privilege? Many of you have seen this definition and have an understanding of it, but now the key is, what do you do about it? I feel like Peggy McIntosh, her article on white privilege that many of you may be familiar with, really identifies some key factors that you want to pay attention to as you move throughout your journey. I oftentimes like to show this particular slide. Many people don't recognize that the color of bandages and ACE bandages is a factor of white privilege. It's not random that an ACE bandage is the color that it is. So for communities of color, we now have Band-Aids. My hope is that this conversation will allow you all to gain the tools and skills you need to dismantle structural racism and move your identity from actor to ally to accomplice or co-conspirator. Here we have August Landmesser, and you see him standing here, arms crossed in the middle of a Nazi salute. He decided that he was not going to participate. He had fallen in love with a Jewish woman who was later murdered in a concentration camp. How will you decide to be the August Landmesser and not engage? My last point, really quickly, is another great man here who created all these wonderful TV shows in the 60s and 70s, Norman Lear. Norman Lear was visited by the Black Panther Party, asked, why are all the Black people on TV that you present all poor, working 3 and 4 jobs to make ends meet? Well, what he did was he took a neighbor from All in the Family after being visited from the Black Panther Party, and he moved this neighbor up, as the song goes, to a deluxe apartment in the sky. And this was the first time you saw a wealthy Black family on TV, because Norman Lear was willing to risk social capital, physical capital, and emotional safety in order to be an ally and an accomplice. My hope is that we are all able to move in that direction. And so now we have some time for discussion.
Well, thank you, Donald. That was a really rich, amazing discussion about race and systemic racism in America. I don't know about you all, but I learned a lot. It's going to take some absorbing, Donald. We're glad that you're coming back with us again on Friday to talk to parents of K through 8 children. So if you don't mind, let's shift the lens a little bit to parenting and families and children. First of all, I know that at Pacific Oaks, the college where you have, you're an executive director, it is known for the development of an anti-bias curriculum that many early childhood programs use. What can you tell us about that? And how do you think that we can better guide children to adapt their conversations around race and racism?
Yeah, part of it, Charlene, our pedagogy speaks to the internal and the external work that needs to be done. And reckoning with some of the things that we've discussed today is one of the first steps at being able to even implement or think about anti-bias curriculum and programming. Louise Derman Sparks, who is the key figure in anti-bias programming, actually did a lot of her early work at Pacific Oaks College, where we also have a children's school. And so that has really been built into what we do. And so the first step is for parents to begin, and teachers and educators to begin to be honest with themselves about with themselves about their own bias and a lot of the institutional factors that may impact their own lens, and then begin to decolonize their libraries, begin to look for first person stories that show and provide the voice for everybody, and foundationally pay attention to how you make every single child feel seen, heard, and valued. And that sets us on the pathway to do it right.
Thank you. Great answer. Here's a question that came in from David Jacobson. What can we do to ensure that children have the opportunity to make Black friends during childhood?
That's a really, really important point. And I'll expand that to children of all cultures, right? And so, what we want to do, what research demonstrates, is that one of the most evidence based ways to break prejudice and discrimination is this process called jigsawing. What that does is it gets different groups together to solve problems where no matter who the person is, everybody has an important responsibility in the outcome. One of the things with team sports is that oftentimes for kids can provide a foundational layer that says no matter what you look like, I've already seen value in your contributions, and that creates that good foundation. Sometimes families have to kind of move out of their geographic neighborhood into a community where they may take a karate class here or something else there. My son happens to attend a very small independent school here in Hollywood that is primarily white. We live in a community where we're the only Black family on our street. And so I also have to make efforts to make sure that my son is not improperly influenced by his all white environment, and that we attend other things, other events and activities where he is able to engage with other Black kids. And so it's not just about getting Black friends, it's about creating a cadre of multicultural friends who your child engages with. Now, here's the key. If you really want to create sustainable change, it's not just about your child having friends who are different. It's about them also seeing you engage in a value added way with multiculturalism. That doesn't just mean that the person who comes to clean your house or your nanny or one of your people who does service work for you, they need to see you engage in an egalitarian relationship with people who are different. So we have to, again, do our internal work and our external work, because that creates the sustainable outcomes that we're looking for.
Very true. My daughter moved to Oakland, California, because she was seeking a more diverse community, and I admire that. She just felt much more comfortable actively putting herself there, and she's really enjoying it. And I hope we're trying to be open too. So again, here's a related question, Donald. What can parents who live in non-diverse communities do to help their children understand and appreciate diversity?
It's a great question. And so exposure is really key. And so how do you expose your children to activities? And again, maybe there's a karate class that you have to drive over the bridge for that's in a different neighborhood than your own. And I know some of those things are not practical in many ways, but we have to make adjustments beyond practicality in order to gain access. Exposing your children to books that are out there, and what I want to make sure we pay attention to, and I mentioned this in another discussion, there aren't enough published books that show children of color just doing normal things. You don't want to disproportionately have your children engaging in books that only show children of color fighting social justice. You want to have movies and films and books that show them doing the same things that your kids do. That's a really important note. And so you really want to expand your horizons, figure out a way to schedule opportunities in spaces that are not segregated. And that's challenging to do. I used to sit on the board at the African American Arts Foundation in the Fillmore district up north, near where you all are. And they have some amazing programming throughout the year that you could take your kids to participate in some of those classes. If your kid does dance, why not do it at a studio where there are in a neighborhood where there are primarily kids who don't look like your kid? Those are all opportunities.
Really great advice. You know, when I was teaching early childhood, Ezra Keats' books started to come out. And I know that The Snowy Day is one of your favorites, but it was important because it was so normal. He was
There's
not advocating for social justice, he was enjoying snow. So the
mm,
very fact that it was a Black child just living his life is what made it revolutionary, right?
That's what made it so great. And Ezra is just this Jewish dude who said, I'm going to write from this perspective, and I'm
Yeah,
going to make sure that people see, this kid just doing stuff.
that's great. Thank you for that. I will say for those of you who were with us last time for the conversation that we had about talking with your kids about race, Donald did run and go get that book. You don't have to do it today, but anyway, we
I
appreciate
actually,
that.
I actually, I actually brought it in here today so that I'd have it, and then I stuffed it on the bookshelf, and I can't find it.
Well, we know what it looks like if you
I
find
did want
it.
to mention this book, and I know we'll talk more about this construct next time, but a lot of people minimize the age at which children begin to learn about race and racism, and we want to say, oh, our children aren't old enough to have an anti-bias curriculum in their kindergarten. I just want you guys to know research in this particular book, the first R, How Children Learn Race and Racism, demonstrates that children begin to make decisions about race and racism as early as 4 years old, and they engage in behaviors connected to those ideals very early on. And so even if you feel like it's too early, I would encourage you to partner with your academic professionals, your teachers and your administrators, because many of them have the knowledge to say and can help you understand why it is important to begin engaging anti-bias curriculum at an early stage. And if the opposite is true, if your teachers are not advancing this effort, saying that children are too young, you have to bring them the information to say, actually, research says otherwise. And there are developmental frameworks and ways at particular developmental stages to introduce concepts that are winners.
Yeah, well said. We know from the research that even infants differentiate between races. So parents, if you think you're protecting your children's innocence, I would say go with Donald's advice and start early, right? Start early and start often. This
Start
is an
early.
interesting question. When donating or supporting causes that support DEI, do you have thoughts on the best places to focus? That is maternal health, scholarships, early education?
Well, it varies. And so I work with a lot of different organizations, and one of my recommendations is oftentimes, how do you redistribute your philanthropic dollars during a time like this? Where do you see value? You see different organizations doing different things. So some of the tech companies gave their employee resource groups, they said, here's $1 million. You guys come up with the best practice to do it. Some of you already have a particular lane of interest that you have. And so if you tend to dedicate your philanthropic funds to academic programs, of course, providing scholarships and contributing in that way is a great idea. You don't have to do something unaligned with who you see yourself to be. You can actually continue your lens in this space, even if you haven't, even if you haven't gone into this space before. If you donate to St. Jude's every month, I'm not saying that you don't, but maybe your area is medical interest. Maybe you want to dig into and understand the research about infant mortality rates in the Black community. My imagination tells me, if you understood the depth of that, you'd be inclined to provide dollars towards research related to infant mortality and maternal mortality for Black women and babies. And so some of you have some great organizations right in your community where you'd be able to have a direct impact and donate, $700 to have a book scholarship for a brand new college student coming from one of the community high schools. And you could do that directly with the high school and offer that and make it competitive, make it an essay contest. There are so many opportunities to do this. And at the end of the day, even soliciting restaurants that are owned by marginalized communities is a value add. You have to eat. So why not deliberately once a week choose to eat at a restaurant owned by a different marginalized community? Maybe this week it's a Black owned restaurant. Next week it's an LGBTQ plus owned restaurant, whatever it is. So I think that we have to make deliberate efforts to dismantle these things with the same level of attendance that America has worked to create them. And one of my efforts today was to hope that everybody was able to see the deliberate nature behind systemic racism, so that you can equalize your deliberate efforts to dismantle the system that has been created so diligently.
All right, exactly. Great advice, everybody. We have lots of very, very interesting, very thoughtful questions coming in, Donald. So let me just take a few of them with you, okay? Here's a writer who says, I was missing the direct reference to value of the human being as being equal. Is this part of unconscious bias?
Yes, it is a part of unconscious bias, and it's a part of what lays the foundation for why we automatically kind of create thoughts and ideas about people is because when that particular heuristic was created to say these individuals are less than human. And remember, it was even baked into the Constitution, 3/5 of a person. There was actually a metric put to how human I was or was not. And so when we talk about that dehumanization, we say we now promote a space where we can continue to treat this group in this way. When, for instance, you think about uh, rape culture. When I was in graduate school, I used to facilitate some groups for male sex offenders as a part of my forensic internship. And one of the rules of our groups was that we would not allow the members to utilize objectifying language about their survivors' bodies. And so they weren't allowed to use colloquial or slang terms because what that did was it maintained the dehumanization of the person who they victimized. When we made them use language that described their body parts as human beings, it added a level of attention to the humanity of the individual. And so that's been taken away for lots of Black and Brown people. Even if you look at some of the Asian American discrimination, particularly during the era of the Vietnamese and Chinese and Japanese exclusion camps, they would put out rhetoric that put Asian faces on the bodies of bugs and roaches and animals to say, we want you to disaggregate their humanity because you won't want to treat them the way I'm asking you to treat them if you see them as human. And so if I make you see them as an animal, a lizard, a roach, I can compel you to do with them what I want you to do. Hitler did the same thing. He dehumanized Jewish people in order to make people get on board with the ability to hurt them and murder them in the way that they did.
Oh boy, you're really making us think today, Donald. Here are a couple of questions. If you can solve these, we'll be way ahead. Related to what you just mentioned, can you compare the idea of accumulated disadvantage to the cohort of recent successful Indian Asian immigrants? What do you make of this? For example, the writer says, I'm thinking of the recent lawsuits brought against institutions for discrimination against these immigrant populations.
It's interesting when you look at different groups of people of color, you identify certain groups that have been utilized as a tool of supremacy. And not as many individuals from India, but definitely people from the continent of Asia and those particular descendants of those immigrants have been identified as what we call the model minority. And many of you are obviously familiar with that term, but many people don't recognize that the model minority terminology was a tool of white supremacy to maintain systemic oppression of other Black and Brown people. And so when we talk about the growth and the success of certain groups, it's important to note that within those groups, colorism plays a significant role in their success. And so if we look at Asian American groups in general, we see high degrees of success in some areas, but we have to be careful to pay attention to groups like the Vietnamese, the Hmong, and the Cambodian Asian Americans who meet with the same level of success as many people in the lower tier groups like Latinx groups and African Americans. And so we have to be really careful with both generalizations of that group and what we call exceptionalism, which are outliers. And if anybody reads any Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers talks a little bit more about how when we attend to those things, we create problems. So when I meet with really wealthy white people and we talk about white privilege, they bring up exceptionalism. They say, well, what about this and what about that? And I have a slide with Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey and all these really wealthy Black people. And I say, if these are your friends, you have a hard time understanding the magnitude of anti-Black racism because your friends don't appear to sit in that space. And so we have to pay attention to exceptionalism and understand that those are all outliers and not the norm.
Thank you. So here's a question. I think this is a great question. As a former early childhood educator, I want to know what you think about this one. We teach our kids to be fair and to take turns, which somewhat means equality. Given your historical presentation, I'm thinking, should we actually reward children to intentionally give one another an advantage?
That's a wonderful question. And so, first, I want to differentiate between equity and equality, right? So, equality is the concept of giving everybody the same thing. Equity is the concept of giving people what they need. And so, even though we don't want to reward children for, giving people a leg up, if you will, if that's the way that the question is being described, we do want to reward them for paying attention to how systems create benefits for some people and how we have to work to dismantle those systems. And so, when men are in meetings and you hear women trying to chime in to get a thought in or a word in, some of you may be familiar with the jump rope game called double dutch, where there are two ropes going. And when you see somebody trying to get in, they're trying to do this to get in between the ropes and begin jumping. You see that happen with women in board meetings where they can't get a word in edgewise, right? And so a man who says, "Hey guys, Jane has been trying to talk for 5 minutes and you guys aren't allowing her to get in, give her space." He's not necessarily saying, "I want to give Jane an advantage." He's saying, "I'm looking at the structure of this room, understanding that it's giving her a disadvantage. And what I want to do is not give her an advantage. I want to take away the disadvantage that is baked into our structure."
And we always tell parents that it is worth being explicit. You can say to children, I noticed that you did such and such, and it actually helped her because you notice that sometimes it's hard for girls to raise their hand or for boys to get to play in the playhouse, whatever it is. I don't think parents should be afraid of being explicit. This is a related question, which I think you're going to enjoy, Donald. This parent asks, I'm always conflicted between parenting in a super inclusive way as opposed to parenting in a way that teaches about oppression. That is, inclusion is positive, teaching about oppression is negative. Thoughts?
We have to be real. My son, as a young Black boy, I've had to talk to him about oppression very early on, and give him tools that differentiate him from some of his friends that he understands that he will be looked at differently. I need parents of children of all Black backgrounds to have those same conversations with their children. I need them to know that when they're hanging out with a boy like my son and they're 12 years old and they're at the mall and they go to 7-Eleven and they always say, well, why does he always ask for a receipt? And he's able to understand that, well, his dad told him, because if somebody was accused of shoplifting, statistically he would be the one accused, and I need him to be prepared at every turn. And so it creates empathy when we're able to operate from an equity standpoint instead of an equality standpoint, and saying, as a result of the structure of our current world, these individuals live in different lanes, and their lane actually requires different tires than your lane does. Now, you may have this particular type of car and they may have the same car, but adjustments need to be made because their route to the finish line is just a little bit different. And that comes along with talking both about oppression and inclusivity, so they're not mutually exclusive.
Well, that's a great metaphor and one you could use with a child of any age. So
Absolutely.
I want to end with one final question that is my favorite, but I really do want to thank everyone for your incredibly thoughtful questions. I wish we had time to get to all of them. If you want to ask and come back, join us on Friday. We're going to do this again, but addressing parents at a slightly younger age group, K through 8. So here's my final question. You've heard it before, Donald. What gives you hope for the future?
Well, I don't know if today's the best day to ask me that question. I'll go ahead and answer. There's a lot that gives me hope for the future, to be honest with you. The American Psychological Association recently released a report that said 7 out of 10 of all Americans as of October 2020 feel hopeful about our future. And so the one thing is that other people feel hopeful, and I too feel hopeful. Another thing that gives me hope is the increase in dollars being spent on diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I find it to be so valuable and so important that people are paying attention to this and honoring the fact that resources need to be allocated to create true change, and that people are paying attention to it. Some people are just checking boxes while others are doing the really heavy lifting. So that gives me hope. And one final thing that gives me hope is the fact that we can fill rooms in conversations like these with people who are willing to learn and unlearn and figure out how they can accommodate this knowledge into their worldviews.
So true. Again, thank you, Donna, for giving us hope, and for all of you who attended today. I'm very hopeful, and thank you so much for a brilliant conversation. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful questions.